The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Montgomery County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Michael Bennett adjusted his black robes as he settled into his high-backed leather chair, his expression stern as always. At 62 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had earned a reputation for being one of the strictest judges in the county. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Law clerks hurried back and forth with stacks of papers, while attorneys and press suits whispered to their clients in the hallways. The air smelled of old wood and coffee, a scent that had become as much a part of the building as its marble columns. "Next case," Judge Bennett called out, his voice echoing through the courtroom. He glanced down at the docket, noting it was a simple traffic violation. These cases usually took no more than 5 minutes of his time. Sarah Williams walked into the courtroom, her steps confident but not arrogant. She wore plain clothes, a simple blue blouse and black pants. Nothing that would suggest her profession or status. At 38 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her natural hair neatly styled, and her face free of makeup. The court clerk announced the case number and violation. Case number 2024 TR 789, speeding violation, 45 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. Judge Bennett barely looked up from his papers. He had seen thousands of these cases, and to him, this was just another person trying to talk their way out of a ticket. "Ms. Williams," he said, his tone already carrying a note of impatience, "how do you plead to the charge of speeding?" Sarah stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. "Your Honor, I plead guilty, but I would like to explain the circumstances if I may." The judge sighed audibly, making no effort to hide his disinterest. "Go ahead, Ms. Williams, but please be brief. The court has a full docket today." Sarah began explaining, her voice clear and professional. "Your Honor, on the evening in question, I was responding to an emergency. I received a call about a situation that required immediate—" "Ms. Williams," Judge Bennett interrupted, holding up his hand. "Everyone who comes into this courtroom has an explanation for why they were speeding. A sale at the mall, running late for work, or some other emergency. The law exists for a reason." Sarah tried again. "Sir, if you would just allow me to—" "That's enough," the judge cut her off again. His voice grew harder. "The posted speed limit is not a suggestion, Ms. Williams. It's the law. When people take it upon themselves to decide which laws they'll follow and which they won't, we end up with chaos." The few people sitting in the courtroom gallery shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, noting the judge's dismissive tone and Sarah's increasingly frustrated expression. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of traffic laws, but this was a legitimate emergency response situation." Judge Bennett's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Ms. Williams, I've heard enough. The fact that you continue to argue rather than accept responsibility for your actions suggests to me that you don't take these laws seriously." Sarah pressed her lips together, choosing to remain silent now. She stood perfectly still, maintaining her composure despite the obvious unfairness of the situation. "Given your attitude and the fact that this occurred in a residential area," Judge Bennett continued, shuffling through the papers before him, "I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500, plus court costs. You have 30 days to pay. Next case." The court clerk began processing the paperwork while Sarah remained standing for a moment longer. Her expression remained neutral, but those watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled into her palms. As Sarah turned to leave the courtroom, she walked with the same dignity with which she had entered. She didn't slam doors or make comments under her breath. Instead, she quietly collected her copy of the fine notice from the clerk, thanked them politely, and headed toward the exit. Judge Bennett had already moved on to the next case, not giving Sarah a second thought. He had no idea that their paths would cross again very soon, under very different circumstances. He couldn't know that this brief interaction would soon force him to confront his own prejudices and change the way he viewed justice itself. The morning sun continued to stream through the courthouse windows, now illuminating the empty space where Sarah had stood, while the day's proceedings continued as if nothing significant had happened at all. Later that same afternoon, Judge Michael Bennett hurried to change into his formal attire for the county's annual Public Service Awards ceremony. The event was being held in the grand ballroom of the City Hall, a beautiful old building with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. As a senior judge, his presence was required to present several awards. "Judge Bennett, you're needed on stage in 5 minutes," a young event coordinator told him, clipboard in hand. The judge nodded, straightening his tie in a nearby mirror. These ceremonies were usually routine affairs: shake hands, give speeches, pose for photos. After 15 years on the bench, he had done this dozens of times. The ballroom was packed with people in dress uniforms and formal attire. Police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and other public servants filled the rows of chairs. Camera flashes popped regularly as local media covered the event. The air buzzed with excitement and pride. Mayor Thompson stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to one of our highest honors, the Medal of Distinguished Service. Judge Bennett, would you please join me to present this award?" The judge walked onto the stage, accepting a gold-trimmed envelope from the mayor. He cleared his throat and began reading from the prepared speech. "This year's recipient has shown extraordinary courage and dedication to our community, with 15 years of distinguished service." As he continued reading, his eyes moved to the next line, and his voice faltered slightly. "Major Sarah Williams of the Montgomery County Police Department." The audience burst into applause as a familiar figure stood up from the front row. Judge Bennett's hands grew cold as he watched Sarah Williams, now dressed in her full police uniform decorated with numerous medals and commendations, walking toward the stage. It was the same woman he had found just hours ago. Major Williams climbed the steps with grace, her boots clicking against the wooden stage. Her uniform was immaculate, the brass buttons gleaming under the bright lights. The judge could now see the rows of ribbons on her chest, each telling a story of bravery and service. The mayor began listing her accomplishments. Major Williams recently led a task force that brought down a major drug trafficking operation. Last month, she rescued 3 children from a burning building while off duty. She has established youth mentorship programs that have helped hundreds of at-risk teens. Judge Bennett's ears were ringing. He remembered how dismissively he had treated her that morning, not even allowing her to explain her circumstances. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She had been trying to tell them about responding to an emergency, and he hadn't even let her finish. As protocol demanded, he stepped forward to present the medal. Major Williams stood at attention, her expression professional and composed. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, the judge saw not anger or resentment, but a quiet dignity that made him feel even smaller. "Congratulations, Major Williams," he managed to say, his voice barely steady as he pinned the medal to her uniform. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied formally, loud enough for only him to hear. The same voice that had tried to explain herself in his courtroom now carried the weight of her accomplishments. The audience's applause continued as photographers captured the moment. The white judge pinning a medal on the decorated black police officer he had misjudged so completely just hours before. The irony was not lost on him. After the ceremony, Judge Bennett watched from across the room as fellow officers congratulated Major Williams. He saw how young officers looked at her with admiration, how community leaders greeted her with respect, how children ran up to her with wide smiles. The weight of his morning's actions pressed heavily on his conscience. He had let his preconceptions cloud his judgment. In his hurry to maintain order in his courtroom, he had failed to show basic respect to someone who had dedicated her life to protecting others. As the evening drew to a close, Judge Bennett gathered his things to leave, knowing that tomorrow would need to be different. The certificate of the fine he had issued still sat in Major Williams' possession, a paper reminder of his prejudice. But more importantly, the morning's events had left an indelible mark on his conscience, one that would demand serious self-reflection and change. The morning after the award ceremony, the local newspaper ran a front-page story about Major Sarah Williams. The article, accompanied by a photo of her in uniform, detailed a career that stood as a testament to dedication and service. In his office, Judge Bennett read every word, learning about the woman he had so quickly dismissed in his courtroom. Sarah Williams' journey to becoming a major hadn't been easy. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on the east side of Montgomery County, she had been raised by her grandmother after losing both parents in a car accident at age 12. Despite the hardships, she had graduated at the top of her high school class and earned a full scholarship to study criminal justice at the state university. Her police academy instructors remembered her well. Williams was exceptional from day one, recalled retired Sergeant James Martinez, who had trained her. She wasn't just physically capable. She had this remarkable ability to connect with people. She could talk down an angry suspect or comfort a frightened child with equal skill. Starting as a rookie patrol officer 15 years ago, Sarah had quickly made a name for herself. In her third year on the force, she had saved an elderly couple from a house fire, breaking down their door and carrying them both to safety before the fire department arrived. The commendation for that act still hung on the wall of the police headquarters. But it wasn't just the dramatic rescues that defined her career. Sarah had started a program called Books and Badges, where police officers would visit local schools to read stories to children. The program had grown from just her alone to over 50 officers participating regularly. Test scores had improved in participating schools, and more importantly, children had begun to see police officers as friends rather than threats. The newspaper detailed the incident that had occurred on the day of her traffic violation. Sarah had been grocery shopping when she received a desperate call from Maria Gonzalez, a domestic violence survivor she had helped 3 months earlier. Maria's abusive ex-husband had shown up at her house, violating a restraining order. Knowing that Maria had 2 young children at home and that regular patrol units were tied up with a major accident, Sarah had immediately responded. Thanks to her quick action, she had arrived before the situation could escalate. Her presence had deterred the ex-husband, who was later arrested by responding units. Maria and her children remained safe. This was the emergency she had tried to explain in court, but Judge Bennett hadn't let her finish. The article continued with quotes from community members. Major Williams helped my son when he was heading down the wrong path, said local resident Thomas Parker. She didn't just arrest him, she got him into a job training program. Now he's in college, studying to become a social worker. Another story described how she had used her own money to buy school supplies for children from low-income families. Every August, she would quietly fill dozens of backpacks with notebooks, pencils, and calculators, then distribute them through local churches and community centers. Last month's rescue of 3 children from a burning building had earned her the department's highest honor. She had been driving home from a community meeting when she saw smoke. Without waiting for fire crews, she had entered the building 3 times to save each child. When interviewed afterward, she had simply said, anyone would have done the same. The traffic violation had occurred the very next day, as she rushed to help Maria. She hadn't been in uniform or in a patrol car because she had been off duty. Yet even in her civilian clothes, she had continued to serve her community. Judge Bennett set down the newspaper, his coffee long forgotten and cold. The weight of his hasty judgment felt heavier with each paragraph he read. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to public service, who had saved lives, mentored children, and built bridges between the police and the community. The article ended with a quote from Sarah herself. I believe in this community. Every day, I see people helping each other, standing up for what's right, and working to make things better. That's what keeps me going. That's what makes this job worth every challenge we face. The words seemed to stare back at Judge Bennett from the page, challenging his own approach to justice and service. That night, Judge Michael Bennett couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind replaying the events of the past 2 days over and over. The clock on his bedside table showed 2:30 a.m., but rest seemed impossible. Finally, he got up and walked to his home office, turning on the small desk lamp. Opening his laptop, he began pulling up case files from the past year. As he read through case after case, patterns he had never noticed before began to emerge. His sentences for minorities were often harsher. He had been less likely to accept their explanations or show leniency. The evidence was right there in black and white. How could I have been so blind? He whispered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. The judge thought about his own background. Growing up in an all-white neighborhood, attending prestigious schools where diversity was lacking, and spending 30 years in a legal system that often treated minorities differently. And all of this shaped his views without him realizing it. He remembered Sarah Williams standing in his courtroom, trying to explain her situation. He had cut her off, assuming she was just another person making excuses. The memory made him cringe. A decorated officer, someone who risked her life for others, and he hadn't even given her the basic respect of listening to her explanation. His eyes fell on a family photo on his desk. His daughter, Rachel, a third-grade teacher, had been telling him for years about the importance of recognizing unconscious bias. "Dad," she would say, "sometimes we make judgments without even knowing we're making them." He had always nodded politely, thinking she was being overly sensitive. Now her words hit home with painful clarity. Getting up from his desk, Judge Bennett walked to his library and pulled out his worn copy of the Judicial Code of Ethics. The first canon stated clearly, "A judge shall uphold and promote the independence, integrity, and impartiality of the judiciary, and shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety." Impartiality, he said out loud, the word heavy with meaning. Had he truly been impartial? The evidence suggested otherwise. He spent the next few hours writing in his journal, something he hadn't done in years. He wrote about his shame, his realizations, and most importantly, his determination to change. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, he made a list of actions he needed to take. First, he would need to address his own biases head-on. He wrote down, "Schedule implicit bias training, not just for me, but recommend it for all judges in the county." Next to it, he added, "Review past 6 months of cases for pattern of bias." The judge thought about the faces that passed through his courtroom every day. Each person had a story, a context, a reason for being there. How many times had he failed to listen? How many times had his preconceptions affected his judgment? Opening his email, he began composing a message to the court administrator. He requested data on sentencing patterns across different demographic groups in his courtroom. It would be uncomfortable to review, but necessary. As morning properly arrived, Judge Bennett got ready for work with a different mindset. His usual confident stride was replaced by a more thoughtful pace. The weight of his realizations showed in the slight stoop of his shoulders and the furrow in his brow. In his chambers, before putting on his robes, he took an unprecedented step. He wrote a note to himself and taped it to his bench where only he could see it. "Listen first. Judge second." The morning sunlight streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across the floor. Judge Bennett stood there for a moment, thinking about Major Williams and all the others who had stood before him. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure a different future. His clerk knocked on the door. "Judge Bennett, court begins in 10 minutes. "Thank you," he replied, his voice carrying a new note of humility. "And Sarah, please remind me to listen to each case fully before making any decisions today." The clerk looked surprised at this unusual request but nodded, "Yes, Your Honor." As he put on his robes, Judge Bennett knew this was just the beginning of a long journey toward true impartiality. The path ahead would be challenging, but necessary. The story broke on social media first. Someone who had been in the courtroom during Sarah Williams' traffic case had also attended the award ceremony. They posted about the incident on Facebook, describing how Judge Bennett had fined a decorated police major without letting her explain her emergency response situation. By noon, local news vans were parked outside the courthouse. Reporters stood in front, doing live updates with the imposing building as their backdrop. Sources tell us that Judge Michael Bennett imposed the maximum fine on Major Sarah Williams just hours before she received the county's highest service award, one reporter said into her microphone. Inside the courthouse, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Betty Thompson, Judge Bennett's secretary for the past decade, struggled to keep up with the calls. "No, the judge has no comment at this time," she repeated over and over. Some callers were angry, demanding the judge's resignation. Others defended him, saying he was just following the law. The local newspaper, the Montgomery Daily, ran a bold headline, "Justice blind or blinded by bias." Below it was a split image. On one side, Sarah Williams in the courtroom, and on the other, her receiving her award. The contrast was striking. Social media exploded with opinions. #Justice in Montgomery became the top trending topic locally. People shared their own experiences with bias in the justice system. Some posted photos of Major Williams at community events, showing her years of service to the county. "I remember when Major Williams helped my grandmother after her house was robbed," wrote one Facebook user. "She visited every day for a week to make sure Grandma felt safe." That's who Judge Bennett fined without even listening to. The police department was flooded with media requests for interviews with Major Williams. Through their public relations office, she released a simple statement. "I respect our justice system and believe in its ability to serve all members of our community fairly." This incident provides an opportunity for meaningful discussion about how we can work together to ensure equal treatment for everyone. Local community leaders began speaking out. Reverend James Thomas, a respected civil rights activist, held a press conference on the courthouse steps. "This isn't about one traffic ticket," he said to the gathered crowd. "This is about the everyday bias that people of color face in our justice system. When a decorated officer can't even get a fair hearing, what chance do ordinary citizens have?" Judge Bennett's colleague, Judge Maria Rodriguez, defended him in an interview. "I've known Michael Bennett for 20 years, she said. "He's strict with everyone who comes before him. This wasn't about race, it was about following traffic laws." But others disagreed. Dr. Patricia Lee, a professor of law at the local university, wrote an opinion piece analyzing years of data from Judge Bennett's courtroom. Her research showed a clear pattern of harsher sentences for minorities, even for similar offenses. By late afternoon, the story had reached national news networks. They played clips from Major Williams' various commendation ceremonies alongside footage of the courthouse. Political commentators debated whether Judge Bennett should step down. The courthouse security guards had to deal with protesters gathering outside. Some carried signs reading "Justice for All" and "Listen before judging." Others showed support for the judge, arguing that changing traffic laws based on who someone is would be unfair. Local business owner Marcus Chen, whose shop was near the courthouse, watched the growing crowd. "I see Major Williams get coffee here sometimes," he told a reporter. "She always asks about my family, remembers my kids' names. She's exactly the kind of police officer we need. This whole thing just makes me sad." Inside his chambers, Judge Bennett watched the coverage on his computer screen. Each new report, each social media post, each protest sign reflected the impact of his actions. The story had become bigger than just him or Major Williams. It had touched a nerve in the community. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Rachel. "Dad, your case is being discussed in my classroom. My students are asking important questions about fairness and judgment. Maybe some good can come from this." As the sun set, the protesters began to disperse, but the conversation they had started would continue. The incident had forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about bias in their justice system, and nothing would be quite the same again. 2 weeks after the incident, Judge Michael Bennett stood in front of the county judicial board. The large conference room was packed with judges, lawyers, and court administrators. His hands were slightly shaky as he gripped the podium, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not here to defend my actions," he began, looking at his colleagues' faces. "I'm here to propose changes that are long overdue in our court system." Behind him, a projector displayed statistics about racial disparities in their county's sentencing patterns. The room was silent as Judge Bennett shared his own story. He admitted his mistakes with Major Williams and spoke openly about the patterns he had discovered in his own courtroom. Some of the older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in understanding. "Starting next month, I will be taking a temporary leave from the bench," he announced. "During this time, I'll be completing an intensive training program on implicit bias and cultural competency." He paused, letting the information sink in. But that's just the beginning. Judge Bennett unveiled his comprehensive plan. First, he proposed mandatory bias training for all court personnel, from judges to clerks. Second, he suggested creating a community oversight committee to review court practices. Third, he recommended implementing a new system where defendants would have more time to explain their circumstances. "We need to collect better data," he continued, clicking to the next slide. "We should track our decisions by demographics, review them regularly, and make the findings public. Transparency builds trust." In the back of the room, Betty Thompson, his secretary, wiped away tears. She had worked in the court system for 30 years and had never seen a judge take such a public stand for change. As Judge Bennett concluded his presentation, an unexpected visitor entered the room. Major Sarah Williams, in full uniform, stood quietly by the door. The judge paused briefly, then continued with renewed determination. "I've also established a scholarship fund," he announced. "The Equal Justice Scholarship will help minority students pursue careers in law. I'm dedicating my next year's salary to start this fund." The room erupted in murmurs. Judge Rodriguez raised her hand. "Michael, these are significant changes. Some might say you're overreacting to one incident." Judge Bennett shook his head. This isn't about one incident. Major Williams' case opened my eyes, but these problems have existed for years. We've just been too comfortable to address them. He then introduced his next initiative, a court observation program. Community members would be trained to observe court proceedings and provide feedback on fairness and treatment. We need outside perspectives, he explained. We've been in our legal bubble for too long. Major Williams stepped forward. If I may, Your Honor. Judge Bennett nodded, surprised. The police department would like to partner with the courts on these initiatives. We face similar challenges with bias, and we should tackle them together. The chief judge, an elderly man named Richard Parker, stood up. This is unprecedented, he said slowly. But maybe that's exactly what we need. He looked around the room. All in favor of implementing Judge Bennett's proposals. Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then more quickly. Even those who had seemed skeptical earlier joined in. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers, emotionally drained but hopeful. On his desk lay the registration forms for his bias training program, set to begin next week. Besides them was a new sign he planned to hang in his courtroom. Justice requires both law and understanding. His phone buzzed with a message from the training center. Welcome to the Cultural Competency Program. Your first session begins Monday at 9 a.m., required reading attached. Outside his window, you could see the courthouse steps where protesters had stood 2 weeks ago. Now, a banner hung there announcing the new court observation program with sign-up information for community volunteers. Judge Bennett picked up his judicial robe, feeling its weight differently now. Tomorrow would be his last day on the bench before his training leave. But for the first time in weeks, he felt truly worthy of wearing it. The sun was setting over Montgomery County, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. Change was coming, not in dramatic gestures, but in careful, deliberate steps toward a more just system. 1 month after the incident, Judge Bennett sat nervously in his office, waiting for Major Sarah Williams to arrive. He had formally requested a meeting through proper channels, and after some consideration, she had agreed. The wall clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. At exactly 2:00 p.m., there was a knock on his door. "Come in," he called, standing up from his desk. Major Williams entered, her uniform crisp and medals gleaming. The same medals he had seen at the award ceremony now seemed to carry even more weight. "Thank you for coming, Major Williams," Judge Bennett said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. She sat down, her posture straight but not rigid. The office felt smaller somehow, filled with unspoken words and shared history. "Your Honor," she began, her voice professional and measured. "I understand you wanted to discuss something with me." There was no anger in her tone, just a calm expectation. Judge Bennett took a deep breath. "Yes, Major Williams. First, I owe you a formal apology." He pulled out a document from his desk drawer. It was the traffic fine receipt. "I've personally voided this fine, though I know that's not the real issue here." Sarah Williams looked at the paper but made no move to take it. "You're right, Your Honor. The fine was never the issue." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years. I've experienced bias before, but what struck me that day was how quickly you dismissed me without even listening." The judge nodded, his face showing the shame he felt. "That's exactly why I asked you here today. I want to listen now, if you're willing to share your experiences." For the next hour, Major Williams spoke about her journey. She told him about her first day at the police academy, being one of only 3 women and the only person of color in her class. She described the extra effort she had to put in to earn the same respect her colleagues seemed to get automatically. "Every day," she explained, "I have to prove myself again. When I'm in uniform, some people see the badge first. When I'm not, they often see only my color. That day in your courtroom, I was just another black woman making excuses in your eyes." Judge Bennett listened intently, taking notes occasionally. He learned about the domestic violence case she had been responding to that day, how the victim, Maria Gonzalez, had trusted only Major Williams after years of abuse. "I promised Maria I would come whenever she needed help," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "That promise means more to me than any speed limit, but I couldn't even explain that to you." The judge set down his pen. "I've spent the past month in intensive bias training," he shared. but I'm learning more from this conversation than from any training session. Major Williams smiled slightly. That's because real change happens through real conversations, Your Honor. It happens when we see each other as people, not just as roles or categories. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. I brought something for you, she said, sliding it across the desk. Inside were letters from community members, describing how the police force had changed since she joined. Stories of trust being built, bridges being formed. These people trusted me enough to share their stories, she explained, just like Maria trusted me. Trust is earned through listening, through giving people the chance to explain their circumstances. Judge Bennett read through the letters, each one adding to his understanding. Finally, he looked up. Major Williams, would you consider helping us train other judges? Your perspective could be invaluable. She considered the offer for a moment. On one condition, she replied, that we also create a program to help young people understand both law enforcement and the justice system. Real change starts with the next generation. As their meeting drew to a close, they both stood. Judge Bennett extended his hand. Thank you for your honesty, Major Williams, and for your service to both the force and our community. She shook his hand firmly. Thank you for listening, Your Honor. Better late than never. A small smile touched her lips, showing that while the past couldn't be changed, the future could be different. As Major Williams left the office, both of them knew this conversation was just the beginning of a longer journey toward understanding and change. 6 months had passed since the traffic court incident, and the Montgomery County Courthouse looked different now. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, and a diverse group of community volunteers wore badges identifying them as court observers. Inside Judge Bennett's courtroom, the changes were even more noticeable. On this particular morning, he sat at his bench, looking markedly different from the man he had been half a year ago. The stern expression was replaced by one of attentiveness, and a small reminder note still sat where only he could see it. Listen first. Judge second. A young black woman stood before him, charged with running a red light. 6 months ago, he might have rushed through the case. Now, he leaned forward slightly. Please, tell me the circumstances, he said, his voice carrying genuine interest. The courtroom was fuller than it used to be. 2 court observers sat in the back, taking notes. A group of law students watched from the gallery, part of the new judicial shadowing program that Judge Bennett had started with Major Williams. During the lunch break, Judge Bennett walked through the courthouse lobby, where a new display caught visitors' attention. Equal Justice Initiative, read the header, above photos showing the courthouse's transformation. One picture showed Major Williams and Judge Bennett together, speaking to a group of high school students about law and justice. In his chambers, he reviewed the monthly statistics that now tracked demographic patterns in sentencing. The numbers showed significant improvement. The racial disparities in fines and sentences had decreased dramatically. A sticky note from his clerk was attached. Latest data looks promising. His phone buzzed with a text from Major Williams, ready for today's youth program. They had created a joint initiative called Understanding Justice, where police officers and court officials visited schools together. It had already reached over 1,000 students. At 3:00 p.m., Judge Bennett left the courthouse and drove to Montgomery East High School. Major Williams was waiting outside, greeting students as they entered the auditorium. They had done this presentation 12 times now, but each session felt important. Good afternoon, everyone, Major Williams began, standing confidently before the students. 6 months ago, Judge Bennett and I had an experience that changed both our lives. Today, we're here to share what we learned. Judge Bennett stepped forward, no longer wearing his robes but a simple suit. I was wrong, he told the students honestly. And from that mistake, we created something positive. He explained how the incident had led to changes in the court system, showing that it's never too late to learn and improve. The students listened intently as Major Williams described her career and the challenges she had faced. When she mentioned the traffic ticket incident, Judge Bennett added his perspective on how unconscious bias can affect even those charged with upholding justice. After the presentation, a student raised her hand. Has anything really changed? She asked skeptically. Major Williams smiled and pulled out her phone, showing recent courthouse statistics. Look at these numbers, she said. Every case now gets a full hearing. Every person gets to explain their situation, and our community observers help ensure fairness. Back at the courthouse later that evening, Judge Bennett sat in his office, reviewing the next day's cases. Each file now included a reminder to consider context and circumstances. His wall displayed a new certification in cultural competency training, along with a photo of the first graduating class of the Equal Justice Scholarship Program. His secretary knocked on the door. "Judge, the Community Oversight Committee meeting starts in 5 minutes." This monthly meeting, where community members reviewed court practices and suggested improvements, had become one of his favorite responsibilities. As he gathered his materials, he noticed Major Williams arriving for the meeting. They exchanged respectful nods. Their professional relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect and shared purpose. The setting sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, just as it had on that fateful day 6 months ago. But now these shadows fell on a different courthouse, a different judge, and a different system, one that was slowly but surely moving toward true justice for all. Walking to the meeting room, Judge Bennett reflected on how a single traffic ticket had sparked a transformation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest changes come from acknowledging our mistakes and having the courage to do better.